We're last year. We got a lot. Because we have live up before having done the budget.
You know, ready?
No, maybe it's taking lunch because we had. Yeah, here. For lunch.
Oh, Charlotte, come and do it.
Yeah. All right.
I have to think.
My vote did not stand. We're not anymore. I guess because we need a funding source.
I might have
Testing PCBs.
I think you're in here because there's a special fund that's created that has potential revenue sources going into it,
Okay.
but those are only potential sources and there's no actual money in the fund right now.
Okay.
That's so familiar.
Debbie,
You should begin.
so, this is Michael Grady with Ledge Council, and we can help you today. But H542, MAC-related to terminate testing in schools in Vermont for polychlorinated biphenyls. You may all remember that in 2022, as part of the appropriations bill, you required A&R to do indoor air quality testing of schools for PCBs. I mean, when I say schools, I mean those I recognize independent schools and those public schools that were built or renovated before 1980. Because after 1980, PCBs left the construction stream, they were no longer used in construction. And you required schools to be tested at that point by July 1, 2024. In 2022, you reserved money in the Ed Fund, $22 million that would be used to fund investigation, testing, and remediation of PCBs in schools. And A&R and AOE were required to come up with a plan for testing. In 2023, based on the A&R and AOE plan, the reserve money in Ed funds plus a little bit more, about a total of $32 million was appropriated to AOE to establish a grant program pay for investigation, remediation, or removal costs for PCBs in schools. As part of the appropriation, the legislature required AOE to be the grants to be sufficient to pay 100% of the school's investigation, remediation, and removal costs. So if it was part of the A&R, if they found that PCBs because of the A&R testing program, and they had to respond, investigate, remediate, mitigate, the state was going to pay 100% of those costs. That was also the act where $16 million was appropriated to Burlington to help cover some of their costs in their PCB remediation and reconstruction. In 2023, the legislature extended the deadline for all schools to test from July of 24 to July of 27. And then in 2025, 9.8 million approximately more was appropriated for PCB testing and remediation in schools. So where is the state? There are 328 schools in Vermont that built or renovated before 1980. So that's the universe of schools that are subject to the potential testing. As of January 2026, 183 schools have had inventories. That's pre-sampling. That's when A&R goes out, their controls goes out to figure out where they're going to do actual sampling. 157 schools have been sampled and 46 schools have PCBs detected above the state action level. But 145 schools still need the inventory of pre-sampling and 171 schools still need sampling. And obviously from those, you don't know how many may exceed school action level and require further action. The money that's been appropriated, the 32 million, the additional 9.8 million, it's been expended or allocated. There's no money left at this time for testing. And the big bill, as far as I know, at this time, doesn't have anything in it for additional testing.
Yes, the question, both the House passed as well as what the bill we just voted on. Neither one had money for additional.
From what I understand.
I did not hear it mentioned.
I think someone asked about it. The answer was no.
So the House addressed this issue by terminating the program. By saying schools no longer need to test. Those that are in the midst of testing will be paid for by the state to finish out. But if there's no funding available to pay for them to finish out, then those schools can pause until funding is made available for them again to pay for 100%. The state has always been committed to that, paying for that 100% of investigation, remediation, mitigation. Schools have been incurring additional costs, like you put in your mitigation measures, your electric bill might go up. And the schools is on the hook for that. The House did have a report back from ANR with a proposal on how to go forward with PCB investigation and testing. But ultimately, there was no money in the House-based program, House-passed program, and the program was terminated. Your Senate Education Committee did not want to follow that path. Instead, what they are proposing to do, which you will see on page 1 of their report, is on page 1, line 21. They are proposing to move the deadline for school testing from July 27th to August 1 of 2031. So this testing requirement is still there. Again, there is no money to do it, but there is still the testing requirement on the books. And then on page 2, section 2, a special fund is created into which money may be deposited to pay or provide funding for the investigation, mitigation, and remediation of PCBs at schools in Vermont. This is why I think the bill is here, because these are effectively revenues. They will include reimbursements from schools that are currently litigating against PCB manufacturers. So if a school does receive a recovery from litigation, they will be required to reimburse the state 100% of the grant that they received from the state for their investigation remediation. You're not allowing the schools to basically double count that grant. And then in addition, any recovery by the state for any claims for damages caused by PCBs, they would also be, so the state is engaged in litigation against PCB manufacturers for state damages. The state, they recover that, money will be appropriated. In addition, monies from time to time appropriated to the fund by the General Assembly. Now, you know, commonly when bills come out of committee, interested parties get interested and ask for changes, and the Attorney General's office asked for a change on page 2, line 12 through 14. They don't want it to say, they basically said that any recovery absent attorney's fees or punitive damages is going to be deposited in the fund. You don't need to reference the natural resources damages because they're already technically required to go into a certain use. So they've asked for a change there, and then JFO asked for a change, page 2, line 15, instead of it saying monies from time to time appropriated, monies from time to time transferred to the fund by the General Assembly. So 2 small tweaks. Moving forward with the substance, page 2, line 20, ANR still administer programs, issue grants to the extent that funds are available. And then there is a kind of a priority of what the grants would be. So the first priority is PCB investigations that are part of the facilities master plan. Facilities master plan is part of your school construction funding that goes into effect in July 1, 2026 this year. You passed it last year, Act 73. In addition, to avoid kind of a dynamic where only those that are in school construction process would have to test or get a grant for testing, you are allowing those schools that voluntarily want to test but aren't in school construction to notify A&R of the testing, and the school district conducts the testing according to DEC standards. And those schools would be eligible for a grant from this fund as well. And then if there is testing and there needs to be PCB management, there would be funding for development of a PCB management plan. There will also would be funding for cost of mitigation when results exceed the immediate action level. There would also be the cost of implementing any corrective action plan. And then the cost of implementing a corrective action plan as part of a school construction project. So short term, you're extending the deadline. Kind of midterm, you're creating this fund and looking for revenues to go into it at some point. If revenues go into it, you will be providing grants to schools to do investigation, testing, and then corresponding mitigation and remediation work if necessary. But right now, the fund has no money in it. If there are funds in the special fund, to the extent that they're available, the state's going to pay 100% of the cost of the school's investigation, remediation, or removal. Again, like it has done for the other schools, but that doesn't necessarily cover every cost that a school may have. Page 4, the balance in the fund carries forward year to year. If the school district recovers money from litigation or other awards, the school district reimburses the state the amount of the recovery of the award. In addition to any other revenue, the state may recover from manufacturers of PCBs under any other type of cause of action. Then you come to section 3. This is the school construction process that you enacted in Act 73 last year. Again, it goes into effect July 1 of this year. This section, the amendment being made in this bill, goes into effect July 2nd, 2026. I did not want to mess with the effective dates of Act 73. I did not want to go into it and make it look like I was amending the section law from Act 73. That was just not a wise choice, in my opinion. So I just moved the effective date one day once this section is in effect. And all you are changing in this section is on page 6. The bottom of page 6, you will see a list of basically actions that are requirements for your preliminary application for school construction assistance. And one of those new requirements is going to be if the applicant school district is applying for construction aid for a school building that was constructed or renovated before 1980, the applicant has to have completed indoor air quality testing for PCBs that was conducted according to DEC standards for testing. So it's a little circular. Remember, you can get a grant from the PCB fund if you're in a master planning process, but you can also get a grant just to do it voluntarily. So if a school is contemplating going into the school construction aid process, once there's money in that process, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but there's no money in that process.
We have 2 funds with no money, right?
Once that money becomes available, the school can kind of plan, all right, we're going to go to school construction planning in 3 years. We're going to request our grant to do voluntary training, voluntary testing this year. So when we apply, we will have met the requirement to have done testing for that school. That's a pre-1980 school. And then page 7, line 11, A&R is required to report to you, the General Assembly, an estimate, the additional cost of the state to complete testing, mitigation, and remediation for PCBs at public school zone, approved and recognized independent schools. Now, plan to fund the cost estimated necessary to complete testing, mitigation, remediation. Now, section 5, remember I told you that since 2022, you've had a state commitment to pay 100% of the cost of investigation, remediation, and removal of PCB testing in schools. Well, that was in session law, and it's not easy to find, and it's kind of confusing. So you've already moved that requirement into the new special funds. So taking it out of session law and removing that duplication and also the non-transparent statement that you pay for 100%. That's what section 5 does. It just eliminates that non-transparent commitment of the state to pay 100% because you've made it transparent in the PCB special fund that you created. Then page 8, line 4, section 6, this is the effective date. Most of the bill goes into effect on passage, except for the amendment to the school construction aid process because of what I already said. That doesn't go into effect when you're at 73 until July 1 of 2026. It didn't want to mess with those dates. It didn't want to give opportunity for whatever would happen. And so
Wise man.
I just amended that on July 2nd, 2026. And then because you're not terminating testing, which the bill, as it passed the House, was entitled, the title of the bill would be changed to an act relating to testing in schools in Vermont for polychlorinated biphenyls.
And I assume to get us the two. And then
I may actually have it right now. I was talking to Matt Chapman a little bit earlier and
have it here.
I was able to get it drafted, but I don't know if I was able to get it edited.
Okay,
Are we gonna discuss the bill or are we hearing from JFO?
we're gonna hear from JFO. I was thinking we should hear from ANR and the Attorney General office.
I've got a question. I think it'd be best for Michael's time. Go ahead and ask me.
To do,
Questions, Mike?
Yeah.
So, Mike, in the bill, it says that all public or approved independent schools have to be tested. I mean, I know we don't have any money in the fund, but if there was money in the fund, is that money also available to both categories of schools, or is it restricted to one or the other?
So for school construction, no, it's only public schools.
Yeah.
For PCB investigation, yes, it's available to both.
What about PCB remediation?
It's a part of that you can see in the list of priorities.
Okay.
It includes things like a corrective action plan, which is effectively remediation of the cost of
Okay.
implementing a corrective action plan.
Okay.
And that was an equity issue because you started this program with it being applicable to public schools and approved independent. And approved independent have been tested.
Yeah.
And so do you then just say any approved or independent that hasn't been tested isn't going to be?
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense. I was just wondering. Okay, thank you.
so
I do have the amendment. I can forward it to Charlotte.
I think that would work. Matt, do you have anything?
I'm happy to answer questions, but no.
They sounded like purely technical amendments.
Do you have a JFO?
Yeah, we've got
Yeah.
it. Comes now. Yes.
All right, for the record, Ezra Holden, going fiscal office. Would you like me to share my screen or just read what I have here?
I think it's pretty, I don't know, it looks like a 2-pager. I guess you'd share it.
It's up to you.
Yeah, well, that's anyone that's watching at home can also
Or
see it.
All right, so big picture, as you just heard from Ledge Council, as recommended by the Senate Committee on Education, this bill would extend the deadline for school districts to have ANR complete air quality testing in both public and then approved as independent school built or renovated for 1984 PCBs. So the big fiscal impact picture is this would extend the deadline for school districts to have ANR complete the PCB testing in their schools to August 1st of 2031, but there is no appropriation. I think you heard a few times there is no money, so there is no appropriation included in this bill for the testing. And because there is not a funding source nor any appropriation named for it, it's unclear how this requirement would be funded. I can go through some of the sections in more detail if you'd like, or just leave it at that, as chair.
So there's no economic impact. If we don't come up with the money, then the schools are still required to test.
So Ledge Council can clarify that.
Yes, the deadline for them to test is pushed out to 2031. There's specifically that requirement. The grant funding is only available to the extent that funding is available.
Okay.
And so on that subject, I will just move forward to section
Is
3.
A and R doing, is that a cost to A and R? Who's paying for the testing?
So for the record, Matt Chapman, I'm the director of the Waste Management and Prevention Division. So basically the funding has been, for the most part, one-time general funds have been appropriated to the agency to do this work up to this point. It's also eligible for us to use funds from a special fund that we have, a different one, the Environmental Contingency Fund, and we have used some of those monies to support the program as well.
Okay, so what I don't want to do is do this and then have 15 local schools yelling that you required us to do this testing and you're not supplying any money. But I'm wondering, have you got the money to continue testing?
Well, I will say the agency's focus at this point has been on ensuring the schools have been tested, get cleaned up. And the priority has been to deal with those issues before we start going out and testing additional schools. I think the other recommendation of both the agencies of natural resources and education is to try and ensure the work that's taking place gets paired with school construction related work because of the overall benefits associated with that. I mean, I think that there's a desire by a number of members on other committees to put a deadline in and sort of push this action forward, and we're comfortable with that. But there's not money available as we sit here today to fund that work.
Senator Brock.
Just an overall question of the schools that have been tested. What have you found?
Sure. We've tested about half of the schools in the state. And of that half of the schools that we've tested, over 30% of them had issues that need to be addressed.
And are these issues that could be health related, et cetera?
Absolutely, yes.
So the question is, we're doing this solely for public schools and independent schools. And if it's a public health issue, I would wonder why it wouldn't be done for all schools.
All buildings.
And well, certainly schools where it's affecting children and whether they happen to fall within the public school parameter or not, it would seem that as a public health issue that do you know whether or not the committee raised this at all in their discussions?
So I know there was initially an effort to have it apply to all public buildings, and the legislature decided not to go that far and repeal that particular
Or people
provision.
know is important fix.
So,
What does it cost to do the remediation? Any idea of that?
So it ranges. I mean, it can be,
It makes sense.
it can be 2,000, relatively confined, like, under $5,000, relatively straightforward. It can also be fairly significant. I mean, we have a couple of schools like Burlington High School and North Medford Union High School that have pretty significant PCP impacts where the costs are much more significant, in the millions of dollars.
which is why I guess we're putting it in with school construction, because that is being, so far, our source of funding is bonding. And you can bond, but the bottom line is we don't have a source of funds. I'll see if the Attorney General will come in and see if they can give us an estimate of how the lawsuits are going, which sounds like the one place where we might recoup some funding. Um,
And of course, it's what we haven't really heard definitively is, are we talking about something that's going to seriously harm a child, or for that matter, cause their death? And whether that's real or not, I don't know. I would think that we want to hear some testimony. I would think the committee of jurisdiction should have perhaps already done it, but if they haven't, I think we should.
I'm trying to remember where, but it gets very difficult because the levels that are safe for high school students are not necessarily safe for kindergartners. And so we're a high schooler, and it depends on how many hours a day you're exposed. So if it's in the art room that you hit once a week, you're probably all right. If it's in the classroom and you're 6 years old, it may not be. And I think
And again,
it
there's
was
still some
A&R.
debate
that
too,
gave
as
the
to whether it is or isn't, and perhaps
Yeah.
just the Vermont's chief health officer might be someone that we want to have testimony from.
Okay, I've got Sandra Hewlett.
Thank you. There's been a lot of testimony on this, but Matt, thanks for being here. So 50% of the schools have been tested. Of the 50% that have been tested, were the majority of those the high risk schools? Because I remember there were like categories of high risk, medium, and low risk. The high risk have been tested.
So we went through a ranking process, and the ranking process included things like the age of the school, the type of building materials we saw in the schools, the number of free and reduced lunches that are offered, trying to take into account and then we basically also allowed schools to self-adjust on that list, right? Some schools didn't want to have more than one at the same time because they were worried about the burden. Others wanted to have them all at once so they could do it and get it done with. So I only give the context to say that it's not really, it ended up at the end of the day not being like a risk-based priority list. There was a lot of movement on that list based on, frankly, school needs and desires.
Okay, so a lot of the cost of this program is falling on the backs of school districts and thus the education fund. So I'm concerned about that, and there's no money in this bill, so I'm obviously very concerned about that, but also. So I heard a lot of anecdotes, and I don't know if you can substantiate any of these, but like one of the stories I heard was that there was a measurement of PCBs, the remediation went in, did what they did, and when they were done, the PCB level was actually higher than before the remediation. That may have been in Cabot, I don't remember exactly sure, but I remember hearing that as one of the stories.
So I think I've heard a lot of anecdotes too. And I think that generally speaking, we have seen that when we take PCB containing building material out, we see concentrations go down. I think one of the things that we learned through this process is that there is a temperature relationship associated with PCBs and indoor air. And so the hotter the rooms are, the more off gassing occurs. So there's I think, this is a process, and I wouldn't want to just, say to anyone that it's not. And I think the agency has learned, and some of the recommendations that are included in this bill have come from both what we've learned from the schools in this process that we need to, we need to be much better as far as trying to accommodate, sort of the schedules, the needs, the operations. I mean, I think we tried, I think this will help us be better. That's some of the objectives around it.
I still think it's the mother of all unfunded mandates, and I think it really has done some harm to some of our schools and made life difficult for school administrators, for many of them, and the students.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have really serious concerns with moving forward with this bill without the funding. That's kind of what we've been doing for a number of years, and it, as Senator Kulik said, has put a lot of strain on school budgets and stress on administrators and kids. And in some cases, kids were forced to go back to sort of COVID era protocols in order to go to school. And I think that one part of the bill that I do like the way that they handled it was that when they do connect it, the part that Michael O'Grady was talking about that is related to Act 73, where they put it as a condition of receiving the new school construction aid and having it be part of that sort of construct of, if they're going to apply for school construction aid under the new future state, they have to do this testing if they're applying for aid for a building built before 1980. So I really like that connection. The setting up of a fund and just continuing to require it, I think is not fair and not productive. I was skimming through the House bill because they end the program, but they do have language in here for how to deal with the schools that have already been tested and that ANR is working with. And so I'm wondering, I haven't fully gone through the bill. Maybe we could get Michael to walk through with us the way that the House tried to deal with this, but I would be supportive of trying to help schools that have already tested, put a pause on new testing, connect it to the new school construction program that we created in Act 73 and that we're going to amend further in H 955. But creating a fund and still requiring it, especially with no money, especially during this time as we're going through so much change in our education system, is just it's not fair and it's not helpful. And we have to just say enough is enough. We've got to move forward.
I would say my concern, it's been a concern since we started talking. We opened this can of worms because the testimony was that PCBs are injurious to children's health. And we're now saying, oh, we don't have the money to fix it, so we're just not going to test. Well, we know that a good portion of these, 320 schools have turned up with PCB levels that need to be remediated. There's thing about should have known. We know there's a potential issue. If we just choose not to test for it, I'm not sure we can excuse ourselves from the responsibility of cleaning it up. We know it's a potential. We know it's real. So if you have one child 20 years from now who develops a rare cancer, there is a lawsuit going on for a building at a university where an extraordinary number of students 20 years later come down with cancers. And there's lawsuits. I'm uncomfortable with just saying it's a problem for the school, so we're not going to ask them to do it. It is a health and safety problem.
I understand that, but if we're not funding it, then we're not holding up our end of the bargain either. So
I don't,
we have to either fund it and say we're doing it and we're gonna support them through it and we're gonna fund it and we're gonna make sure kids don't miss school and we're gonna do all the things like they did in Burlington, or we have to take care of the schools that we've already started with and make sure they finish the process because those have been tested. We do know about it. And then the next half of the schools, as the school construction program gets up and running, and we have them applying for state aid for school construction, they start to tick off that list of school districts that need it. And that program also doesn't have funding in it, so we can't fund both. And we have to prioritize what we're doing here. And this is, if we go fix a bunch of school buildings that have PCBs in them, and then we also are trying to fund school construction, we have to align them in a way that makes more sense and
aligning
prioritize
them is good. I just have a problem with saying we don't have the money to fix it, so we're not gonna.
I don't think that's what the House bill does. I think the House bill says, let's fix what is already known. And then and then moving from there, if we add the language that's in the Senate bill that connects it to the new school construction, then that provides a path forward.
We'll save it for our.
And again, I won't claim that everything I read in the newspaper has been thoroughly retained, but I know I've read one or more articles that say that the initial evaluations, things like Burlington High School, overstated the danger of what was there. I don't know if that is or is not valid, but just the first piece of understanding what it is we're dealing with. Do we have a real problem? And that is again, something that I'm amazed if nobody's done that yet, given the furor about this and potential danger, to determine that first. And then I don't think it's a responsible thing to do if it is a genuine threat to simply ignore it because we don't have the money to fix it right now. I think that's irresponsible on our part.
Yeah.
Even if we don't have the money to fix it, to at least identify it so that people know what they're getting into, and so that it impels us forward to a plan to fix it if it, and it's a big if in my mind, demands it.
I think. Yeah. Are you?
I'm happy to come up and
answering
try and answer
Yeah,
some of these
okay. Well,
questions.
Esther, I don't think we're at all, we understand we have no money. This is not news.
Well, Matt is coming up tonight to say something,
Yeah.
which is, I think if we're gonna open up this bill, like it seems like we are, we need to take a lot of testimony. This is very complicated. And you will hear that when it comes to PCB testing, one day it could be bad, the next day not so bad, and it's air quality. So it is, and I want to hear, and I do want to hear stories and anecdotes from superintendents who've gone through this. I think that's really important. But to your point about Burlington, there were parts of the school that did have really high levels. There was a coating on some of the metal in the tech center that was really high PCBs. Other parts, not so much. But at the time, and Matt, you can elucidate on this, but our PCB testing levels or thresholds were extremely low. They have since been elevated.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it was parts, it was like 5 parts per.
It was very low.
Yeah, it was very low.
It's like almost what Andy Harris.
Yeah, it was just, it
Well,
was.
the other issue is in terms of this is all anecdotal of what the data is, they may get sick from it. Really, kids?
It's hard to know because of.
Yeah, it's
Is there any
a
evidence?
long-term thing where,
Well, schools weren't built yesterday, so they're testing.
okay,
If
Matt,
it's-
and
if
then
it's-
we're gonna
if it's-
end this, because we
Right.
obviously are not voting this bill out.
So just acknowledging sort of the policy tension that's been discussed here is the exact same policy tension that was discussed in the Senate Education Committee. You know, the agency's original proposal was to basically align this with the school construction proposal, knowing that that was a future sort of need. And I think that there was concern because of the health related issues that it moved faster than the track that school construction is on. So that's my impression of the tension that existed in the Senate Education Committee. Obviously, you can have them in the talk if you so choose. Deputy Commissioner of Health came in to talk about the health effects associated with PCBs. They are effectively a known carcinogen. They're one of the very few contaminants that the United States has prohibited their use. And while they can't say that people are sick from PCBs, they have received health effects from parents and students, faculty at schools with PCB contamination that are consistent with adverse health outcomes from PCBs. So this is, it's a real problem. And it's one I think that, you know, we take pretty seriously. Having 30% of the schools having issues that need to be addressed. That's a large number in my world of environmental contamination. We get concerned about that. I think that I also want to just acknowledge, right? Like this is disruptive in a school, right? It is difficult for parents and administrators. And, this is, I think, part of at least why we came in and tried to align some of the work that's planned here with school construction, because if you're going to have a known disruption anyway, pairing this with that sort of work makes sense. While also giving schools, and there are quite a number of schools, the ability to move forward and test because they want to anyway, because their communities are concerned about it, because parents want it and the faculty want that information. So
Is Vermont or Burlington different than everywhere else in the US? Is this is this a national problem or is this a local problem?
I think, and again, based on what I've heard, we have some of the oldest school sort of stock in the United States, but I think that to the extent we're talking about schools that are pre-1980, you may see similar problems because of the type of building materials that were used during that period, contain significant quantities of PCBs.
So this will be the last thing I say about this, but I don't know if joint fiscal has how much we've spent on this program thus far. My issue is that we are spending all this money and then we're turning around and telling our education system that it's too expensive. And I just have an issue with that.
Okay. But I think our prime responsibility is to the health of children.
I agree, but then don't point the finger at our system.
I don't know,
being too,
pointing any
oh my gosh.
fingers at this point.
So we can't turn it back to something like this.
Thank you. I'm gonna move us on to our next topic. I will have the AG's office in to tell us about lawsuits, because that seems to be the one potential place that we may get some non-tax dollars. But that may be more wishful thinking than one that we want to go with. Okay, and we can have the Department of Health in. I'm gonna move us on to 567. Cameron's been here.
He won't be here imminently.
He'll be here eminently. This is unclaimed property, state retirement systems and capital debt. Okay. This is on our website.
He's on his way, Madam Chair.
Take this time to read it. This time. Something tells me this won't be quite as volatile as the last discussion, I hope. But I got lost in the first three sentences. So this sounds like one of those omnibus bills that or maybe the treasurer's office. Okay. So walk me
ma'am.
through what the treasurer needs.
Okay, for the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm going to share my screen and we'll start walking through H567. So I'll do my best to be somewhat succinct, maybe get you back onto your timing schedule. Because this bill, although it is 36 pages, pretty straightforward in what it's actually accomplishing here. There are a few sections here at the beginning that make amendments to the unclaimed properties chapter, and I'll walk through those. And then the vast majority of the bill is moving the administrative and fiduciary responsibilities of overseeing the state employees and teachers' other post-employment benefits funds, the funds that are used primarily to cover their health care after they retire, moving the administration and fiduciary responsibility of those funds from under the treasurer and moving them to VPIC, the Vermont Pension Investment
That was
Commission.
part of the budget today.
And so what you'll see when I get there, you're going to see, like I said, it's the vast majority of the bill is simply deleting language in one section or in sections, and then moving the language over to the VPIC chapter and putting the language right back in place, word for word. So there's not really any new language and not really any language that's being deleted. So, and then at the very end, we have some technical amendments to the section regarding the Capital Debt Advisory Committee and the report that they provide to you all on an annual basis. So to begin with unclaimed property, we have section 1. Amendment down here at the bottom to allow the treasurer's office to receive unclaimed property that's owed under a medical insurance policy. And then at the top of the next page to allow them to require that the entities that are providing that information, the entities that are providing the money from a medical insurance policy, to allow the state treasurer to require them to provide more information so that the treasurer's office can ensure that the money is going to the right individual, or they can work with a medical provider to ensure that the money is being, kind of financed back to an individual's account. So pretty just kind of minor changes here, giving them, again, authority to request more information so they can ensure that the money is going back to the specific individual who is owed it. The next changes here are section 2 and 3. First off, when you look at the unclaimed property chapter, the treasurer can deduct certain expenses from the money that they have in unclaimed property. They're required to do a look back and see how much money are they giving out on a given year, and then they need to maintain a certain amount in order to make sure they're able to pay out, requests for money. They don't just hold all the unclaimed property, from the beginning of the program. They do transfer money to the general fund on an annual basis. They're allowed to deduct certain amounts from what they transfer over before they do the transfer. And then what's key is this subdivision 5 here. The treasurer's office is allowed to deduct property valued at $100 or less that is more than 10 years old. And then what they do is they transfer that money to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. That's current statute. So what this bill is proposing to do is, as you can see, it's going to increase the threshold from 100 to 150. So anything that's now 150 or less and greater than 10 years old is going to be withheld. And then the language here on the bottom of page 2 and moving over to the top of page 3, instead of depositing the money in the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund, they would be required to deposit the money into the Vermont Retirement Security Fund, which is the administrative fund that they use to oversee the Vermont Saves program. So diverting it away, higher education, to the Saves Administrative Fund with a cap of up to $300,000 per year. And so what you see in this A is the treasurer shall deposit the funds to Vermont Retirement Security Fund. And then in the sub B here, it says notwithstanding that, in the administrator's sole discretion, funds can be deposited into the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund, still keeping the cap of $300,000. So again, what are we doing? You're saying that under law, you're required to put it into this Vermont Saves Admin Fund, but we're giving you the sole authority to reduce that amount and still continue to put money into the Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. My understanding here is that they're wanting to be able to divert some of this money over a few years to build up the administrative fund that they use to oversee the Vermont Saves program, to get that to a more sustainable place. And then over, years, they'll start to divert money back over to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. Ultimately, this is all repealed in 2040. So it has a built-in sunset here where January 1 of 2040, the diversion of money to the Vermont Saves Admin, that language goes away. And I should say, you can see it being repealed here under section 3. So you're going to repeal it in 2040, and then all of the money will begin to go back to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund.
We're definitely going to
Yes, ma'am.
Who's here? Yes, we are. Okay, we'll hear from you
Okay.
if you're ready.
Okay. So that is section 3. Then we get to section 4. We're still in unclaimed properties, and we're dealing with the section. These next few sections here are under certain circumstances when there's kind of kind of de minimis amount or a de minimis threshold, you all have put into statute to give the treasurer the ability to issue out unclaimed properties in a more expedited fashion, as opposed to requiring people to go through all of the checks and providing documentation, etc. So these next few sections are upping those kind of minimum de minimis amounts. So here, the claimant has to verify the claim as to its completeness, except the administrator can waive certain requirements to distribute out unclaimed property if the property has a value of less than 250, you're raising it to $300. So if it's less, 300, wow, if you're raising it to 1,000. So if it's 1,000 or less, the administrator, the treasurer can waive certain requirements to be able to distribute the money more quickly. Similarly, here on page 5, this is for deceased owners. So currently, if there is an open estate, the administrator has to pay the money to the executor of the estate. If there's a closed estate and it's valued at less than 5,000, the treasurer's office can distribute it in accordance with the decree of distribution from the probate court. And then in the absence of an open estate, or in the absence of a decree of distribution, then the treasurer's office can provide it to the surviving spouse, or if there is no surviving spouse, to the next of kin in accordance with your statutory section governing how you would distribute property. In the event that there is no surviving spouse, you're increasing those thresholds from $5,000 to $10,000. Next section, similarly for deceased individuals, if there's multiple claimants, you're increasing the threshold where they can just provide it to an appropriate share of individuals who are claiming it, or for the first person who claims it, if there's multiple people. Okay, so again, just bumping up those kind of thresholds, allowing the treasurer's office to do a kind of faster claims process and get money out to individuals in accordance with statute. That's the unclaimed property sections. Now we're going to move over and talk about the Vermont State Retirement System. And then the first section here is about, get to the page. This is about political subdivisions that are participating in the state system. So if you all recall, we did, I think it was 519 recently, and we talked about municipalities that are participating in the state retirement system. Well, there's no mechanism currently in statute for the treasurer's office to assess a penalty against those municipalities if they're not paying the amount that they're required to pay as the employer when those amounts are due. So that's the language that you see here on page 7. Any payment due that are not received within 30 days after the installment due date set by the board result in a penalty assessment against the employer at the rate of 1% of the amount due for each month. So this is adding in statute, giving the treasurer's office the ability to assess penalties against those political subdivisions. Next section is section 7. You're creating a pension and benefits funding task force to review and report on funding methodologies of the Vermont State Retirement System and State Teachers Retirement System, including post-employment benefits systems. It has a membership list here. Not going to go through it line by line unless you all would find that to be helpful. You get to page 9. Here are the items that this task force will be looking at. Long-term sustainability of the pension and benefit plans, total cost of the funding over time, predictability and stability of annual actuarially determined employer contributions, the impact of any change in the funding methodologies and the state's credit rating, best funding practices as recommended by actuaries and implemented by peer public pension
Did we
systems.
just do this?
No, I don't think you just did it, but it's. I can,
Couple years ago, we did a meeting.
I'll talk.
Are you talking
Yeah, I'll
about
talk.
this? Like, do we need another task force, Chris?
I'll
Like
talk
we-
about it later.
Or how about it?
I'll talk about it later.
We can't, Chris.
I could explain this to you in layman's terms, but yes, the JFO, Chris, is probably better able to articulate to you the value of having this in, why it's needed now, or why it's being requested. So,
Or why it's not.
yes, ma'am. Okay, so the rest of this, you have standard task force language. They have the assistance of the treasurer's office, VPIC, joint fiscal office. There's a report due December 15th, 2026. Meetings of the task force, and then how they select chair, compensation, etc. So all of the standard provisions that we include within study committees and task force, etc. Okay. Now we're on page 11, and here's where I was going to say everything from page 11 all the way through to page 33 is moving the administrative and fiduciary responsibility of the other post-employment benefit trust funds from the state treasurer over to VPIC. And so you have a lot of language, for example, sure, this right, starting on page 12. You have language here allowing, it says the commission, but this is within the state treasurer's sections here. It's the commission shall designate from time to time a depositary for the securities and evidence of indebtedness held in the funds of the system, may contract for the safekeeping of its securities and evidences. This is being deleted here on page 12.
Which fund is this now?
This is in the language associated with the retirement fund, I believe. It's in 471. But so the point here is they're consolidating some of this language over into the VPIC chapter because they're moving all of these funds over to be overseen by VPIC. So it's being deleted here in this section, but then it's being added right back here in the VPIC chapter.
It's a cut and paste, but you have to
Yes, ma'am.
change words.
Yes, ma'am. Right. So there's certain, because again, VPIC oversees your retirement funds currently. They just don't technically, according to the statute, they don't oversee the other post-employment benefit funds. And so part of all of this change here is not only moving the administrative and fiduciary responsibility of those funds, it's also trying to consolidate some of the language into the VPIC chapter and remove it from the different references in the state retirement sections, the teachers retirement sections, and the municipal retirement sections.
Does this bill go to GovOps?
Yes, ma'am. It started in House GovOps, came out of House GovOps, and then when it came over to the Senate, it was in Senate GovOps.
Okay.
And so a few other things that I will point out. For example, on page 14, You have here, sub C, the state treasurer is the custodian of assets of the funds of the retirement system. So we're removing that. And again, all of that is consolidated over into the VPIC section. Here in the current sections governing the retirement system, you have these kind of standards of conduct here on sub D, page 15. So it's no trustee, no employee of the board or member of the commission shall have any direct interest in the gains or profits of any investment made by the commission. We're removing the reference to the commission in these sections. And again, it's because it is being consolidated over here in the VPIC chapter. Except as otherwise provided in this section, no member, no employee of the commission shall have any direct interest in the gains or profits of an investment made by the commission. So again, it's deleting the words in the retirement system sections and ensuring that they are included into the VPIC chapter. So it's just a consolidation of references to the commission, their administrative requirements governing these funds, etc., consolidating all of that over into the VPIC chapter. And so I'm happy to continue to go over all of those changes section by section if you would like me to, or I can skip ahead to the next substantive pieces here.
Back in.
Okay. So,
They do worry that it's back in the face.
yes, ma'am. There's a few, technical amendments. So for example, we're having to add in the other post-employment benefits into the definition of plans under the VPIC chapter so that they're covered entirely. There's a few technical amendments like that, but as I mentioned, from pages 11 to 33, there's nothing new and nothing that is being deleted that isn't corresponding somewhere else in the VPIC chapter. Okay, so that's going to bring me all the way to page 30. These next two sections are for, you'll see these are about credits for an individual's pension. And so this is in the teacher's retirement system here, section 21, we're in title 16. And what we're adding in here is to say that an individual who is a member, so they're a member of the teacher's retirement system, and that individual is on lines 19 and 20, elected to serve as the president of an employee organization designated as the exclusive bargaining representative for employees in that chapter. So we're talking about the Vermont NEA here. If an individual who was a member employee is elected to serve as the president of that organization, they can have those years that they serve as president credited to their retirement plan, as long as the employee organization, where is it? Here it is on lines 3, provided that on behalf of any member who so elects, the employee organization shall deposit in the pension fund an amount computed at regular interest to be sufficient to provide at normal retirement an annuity equal to 1 2/3 of 2%. So they can use the years they're serving as president of that organization as credit to their retirement calculations, as long as that organization is going to pay on their behalf to cover those costs.
Okay. And is this, it's an active member of the NEA,
So it would have to be an active member of the retirement system.
of the retirement? That's,
Yes,
okay,
ma'am.
that's what I want
And
to
then
make.
they're
sure you're not
elected to
double.
become president of the NEA, so they're no longer a member. They can use those years that they're serving as president of that organization. They can get credit for those years served, as long as that organization is going to be funding, the portions that would have to be funded into the retirement system during that period.
So is this like for one person?
Yes.
How did it stay in the classroom and teach?
I would not be the right person to answer that question.
You're not.
Well, is this a full-time?
Absolutely.
Well, I suppose this is a question for the treasurer's office. Never matters.
Cam, if you scroll down a little bit, and it says, 7 and 8. Is it based on their members' average final compensation as president or as a teacher? It would be their average final compensation for years that they're serving in the system, right? So that would include years as president, right? Or no? No, I'm assuming it's not.
Well, that's true.
But president,
Yeah,
let me double check.
Okay.
That was even further less.
So, I mean, to Senator Beck's question is this one person, are there other offices? And maybe this is not a question for you either. I don't know. Other offices besides president that this
Yeah.
could apply to, you know, like the vice president, the secretary, whatever. I don't know. Are there other officers? I mean, why would we just do it for the president?
And is this a full-time?
And right, is it a full-time gig?
My understanding, yes, it's full-time. I can't answer the other piece.
Okay.
Maybe that's the
That's why
treasurer's
you're
office.
not
That's what it's
teaching
requesting.
this full-time.
Right. I mean, I understand. It's just weird to do something for just once.
Okay, let's finish going through this. We've got I looked in the treasurer's office here, and then we've got Chris,
And I have to be elsewhere at 2:30, Madam Chair.
and you have to go at 2:30.
I will be done in 60 seconds.
Good.
Okay, this next section is similar for municipal, so same language. An individual member who is in the municipal requirements here, if they've been elected to serve as president of an employee organization governing those municipal employees, it's all the same language as long as the employer is paying in to cover the cost, then the individual could use those years served as president of that organization as credit to their retirement. And the last changes here is regarding capital debt. So you have the Capital Debt Advisory Committee. They provide a report to you all on an annual basis about, see, where is the change? We'll start with 4. Part of the report is criteria that recognized bond agencies use judging the quality and issue of state bonds. And there is a change here where within that, the committee can look at other metrics at their discretion. And this is taking away that discretion and saying they can only look at other metrics adopted by those recognized bond agencies. So it's kind of a limitation on the other things that the committee can look at. And there's another technical amendment here on page 36. As part of the report, the committee has to include capital asset depreciation ratios reflecting unfunded capital maintenance costs, and instead its measures reflecting the remaining useful life of state infrastructure and the potential for future capital maintenance or replacement costs. I'm not aware of what the substantive differences between those words, because to me they say the exact same thing. But my understanding is the Capital Debt Advisory Committee prefers it to be worded this way. And that is when in their report they submitted requesting these changes. So, and then you have an effective date, it's July 1 for everything other than the task force, which is on passage to allow them to begin their work as quickly as possible.
Okay. So let's do Chris, because he's got that minute of time, we'll do the treasurer's office. And then we're going to school construction. Fun.
Yeah, and I don't think this will take real long, Madam Chair. The Arctic District Joint Fiscal. Cam did an excellent detailed walkthrough, and the deputy treasurers here in the audience in case members of the committee have questions about the why behind these proposals. But I'm really just going to focus in the fiscal note on the provisions that really involve money. So that's a much smaller subset of the pages you just went through. I'm going to start with the unclaimed property piece. I don't know if this committee is aware, but there's something called the Higher Ed Trust Fund. And it receives money not only from the estate tax windfalls that show up every once in a while when revenues exceed 125% of the July forecast, but the Higher Ed Trust Fund gets a small contribution every year from sort of low dollar, very old unclaimed property that's under $100 and over 10 years old. this has generated not a huge amount of money to the higher ed trust fund. You know, you all have heard about the trust fund a lot this session. This past year in FY 25 was the biggest contribution they got from unclaimed property, and it was $147,000. So this is a marginal contributing factor to the higher ed trust fund. What the treasurer's office is proposing is to do really kind of two things. One is increase the dollar threshold from $100 to $150 of that over 10-year-old unclaimed property that would be eligible to transfer. And then for a time limited period that would run until the authority would lapse in 2040, they would have the ability to take up to $300,000 a year of that unclaimed property and put some of that toward the Vermont Saves program as it continues to ramp up toward financial self-sufficiency through program fees, which is going to have, they're expected will happen by FY 33. So of that unclaimed property, that up to $300,000 could be considered. Some of it could go to the Vermont Saves program. The remainder of it in the treasurer's discretion could then go into the higher ed trust fund up to that $300,000 limit.
And Vermont Saves is our
That's
public IRA retirement
Yeah, it's
fund
like-
that businesses and their employees
It-
can agree to save in.
Yeah, the employees, businesses are required to participate. The employees, it's an opt-out. So you're automatically enrolled until you say otherwise. And it's like a Roth where members, the employees can withdraw the contributions they make. And the employer doesn't have to pay toward the cost of the program.
But
But-
it needs to be capitalized.
Right, because it's meant to be self-sufficient on program fee revenue, and the program's relatively new, and as it ramps up, that revenue will then ramp up as account balances and the number of accounts increase. But the real takeaway I want to show you here is that you know, there's a little bit of a redirect in the near term with some of that unclaimed property going to Vermont Saves instead of the higher ed trust fund. But by increasing the threshold from $100 to $150, it actually makes a whole lot more money available to go into the higher ed trust fund over time than what we would see under status quo. So I'm going to skip ahead here to table 1. Will just show you in recent years how much has gone to the higher ed trust fund from this low dollar unclaimed property. So if the threshold was $150 as proposed, instead of the $100, a whole lot more money would have gone into the fund. So by making that change and increasing the threshold over time, actually more money is going to be going into the higher ed trust fund than they would see under status quo, even with that temporary redirect of the revenue in these next couple of years toward Vermont Saves. The treasurer's office and I have been cribbing each other's materials. So I have taken their data to make figures in here, and they have used my figures in their charts. So if I'm not around after 2:30 and you have more questions about this, the deputy treasurer can show you numbers that are consistent with what I'm showing you here. The other thing that I'm actually really excited to talk about, Senator Hardy, is this pension and benefits funding.
Oh my
task
gosh,
force.
you're gonna be on it?
I am not on it, but I'm certainly going to be paying attention.
Oh my.
So you're absolutely right that a few years ago, there was a very deep dive pension task force that looked at both systems, met, I believe, 17 times over 2021. And the end result of that was Act 114. The only bill that I'm aware of that passed the body unanimously was vetoed, and then the veto was overridden unanimously. Not that I'm bragging, but that was a fun legislative achievement to witness. What this does is, this proposal actually is similarly structured to have representatives of labor and the state, but it is a much more skinny down version to really look at one issue. A few years ago, we were looking at everything. Here, this is really looking at the funding policies for dealing with our unfunded liabilities for the pension systems. So this committee is familiar that our pensions are on closed single layers that end in 2038. So our funding math is always calculated to get us to full funding in FY 38. The problem is FY38 isn't really that far away. And as you get closer and closer to that date, we have fewer and fewer years to amortize the impacts of any shocks to the system that could happen. And a year or two ago, the pension systems did a risk assessment, which is something they periodically do. And the actuaries flagged this as something that, you know, when you think about if the economy did something really wild in like 2032, the effect of that would begin showing up in our ADAC payments in FY34 due to the timing reasons. So you'd only have like 4 or 5 years to spread that impact across, and that could lead to some really wild volatility in the state's funding requirements for the systems. The other thing is, you know, what do we do? What does life after 2038 look like? You know, no matter how well we manage our systems, is the reality of a defined benefit system that you do not always hit your assumptions perfectly every year. So we need to figure out what is our plan going to be for dealing with gains and losses in the years beyond 2038. So like one approach could be that you move to a layered approach where every year might be amortized on its own closed layer over time. And those are sort of added up and down every year to calculate
That's
your
a
funding
cool graph.
requirement.
Why didn't you make one?
That'll be for the summer. We need to have something to give you to look forward to in January.
Cannot wait to see that graph.
But this is something that a lot of systems are moving toward, is instead of doing everything on one closed layer, maybe deal with every year on its own closed layer. I'm personally, you all know that I nerd out about pension stuff. I'm excited that the treasurer's office came forward with this now, because I think it is wise for you all to have this conversation under what passes for a blue sky economically. It is not great to have this conversation when you're trying to deal with a near-term budget shortfall, because the circumstances around the conversation can dictate the end result of your work. So there is a $75,000 one-time appropriation in both bodies' budget constructs to pay for actuarial work, to do some runs and come up with a plan. But I think the goal here is to have all the stakeholders to meet not more than 6 times and come up with a consensus plan that can be offered to the legislature. And since both chairs of the appropriations committees are singled out here, I think that is because this really is about budgetary funding for the unfunded liability. It's not about plan design or employee contribution rates. It's really very narrowly focused. Are there any other questions about that? Okay.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to mention, and yeah, there's funding in the budget construct to pay for this. Sections 8 through 20 that deal with the OPEB fiduciary oversight. All I'm going to mention about this is a few years ago, you all had directed the treasurer to come up with a report on OPEB governance. And the primary, I believe that came out in January of 2024. The primary recommendation was to move away from the current sole fiduciary model, where the state treasurer is the sole fiduciary for the OPEB systems. It's kind of an antiquated model. Not as many places are using it anymore. And bring OPEB more in line with how the pension systems are done with VPIC, where VPIC is a body that is made up of employee and employer reps. The treasurer is on it, and they essentially manage the investments for the pension systems. You know, when the OPEB systems were very small, they were invested by the treasurer in the trust investment account. We now have hundreds of millions of dollars in the OPEB systems, and that will grow over time with pre-funding. So this is designed to sort of bring the governance more in line with the size of the systems and the direction they're going. There is some budgetary mechanics involved. All of this is reflected in the budget construct that passed out of Senate appropriations. So there's some pieces that are moving out of the treasurer's office and over to VPIC, and those mechanics are reflected in there. The only other thing I really wanted to mention here was around those service credit purchases. This would be actuarially neutral to the pension systems, because the employing organization, in this case, the labor unions, would be making a payment to the system that's actuarially equivalent to the year of service credit someone is earning. In that year, they may serve as president of the labor organization and not serving in their regular capacity as a teacher and earning service credit normally. I would say we do have other service credit availabilities in statute. You can buy the Peace Corps service, you can buy, I think military service and some other things. So this is analogous to that. And the really key here, I think, is regardless of where you land on the policy, the wording is intended to make this cost neutral of the system. So you're making a payment in that is designed to pay for the cost of long-term benefit. So I'll shut up on the fiscal note and if there's any other questions anybody has on it. Otherwise, I don't know if the committee wants to hear from the deputy treasurer, but
I would, we're getting short on time. I thought we were way ahead, but we.
You have 5 minutes, right, before you have to leave.
I do.
Can you just go over because I was zoning out a little bit until Chris like started staring at me. So this
Yeah.
Chris, about the funding construct for the higher education fund,
We're gonna show that again.
because it's clear I care about this.
That was something real quick. So right now, the overwhelming majority of the funding for the higher ed trust fund comes from excess estate tax revenue, which
Yep.
shows up less than half of the time. Every year, a small piece of funding also comes from small dollar unclaimed property that's over 10 years old. Unclaimed property that's under $100 in value. And you can see what the recent history of that has been, around 100,000 and change coming from this. It's a marginal contributing factor.
Okay,
What the proposal is to increase the unclaimed property threshold from $100 to $150.
okay,
That makes a whole lot more unclaimed property available for this transfer. But the amount of that would be eligible for transfer in any given year would be capped at $300,000 a year. So if we go up to figure 2, you notice all of those bars are $300,000 a year. What the proposal would allow is for the treasurer to I don't really like using the word divert, but redirect some of the money to Vermont Saves to make sure that it has what it needs as it continues to ramp up to fiscal self-sufficiency. So you see the blue section going down over time. And then whatever is left over up to that $300,000 cap, the treasurer can then still transfer into the higher ed trust fund. So you can see that even in those alpha years, the amount of money in those standard colored bars greatly exceeds the amount of money that has been going into the higher ed trust fund from unclaimed property under status quo, which in FY25 was $147,000. So over time, the higher ed trust fund is still going to be getting more money. And the treasurer's projections expected by FY33, Vermont Saves isn't going to need any more of this. And the full up to $300,000 from unclaimed property would be available to go to the higher ed trust fund.
so up until 2033, that's the year you said that he thinks they won't need any.
Right.
What goes to the trust fund?
So it would be the top columns there. And this is just from the unclaimed property. So that starts at like 58,000 and then gradually ramps its way up as the amount that goes to Vermont Saves would go down. But, even by FY29, that projected 161,000 is more than what the higher ed trust fund has received from unclaimed property at any point up to now.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
That was helpful. David, I'm not gonna,
Okay.
maybe we'll finish, but I've got a full house here for the next topic.
Understand.
And then maybe when we finish, we can get back to this one. In the scheme of things, this one's probably a little easier. Think. Okay, so we are going to move on to 955. And that's relating to the next steps in transforming the Vermont education system. We don't have the bill yet. It is still in Senate education. But there's several sections we're going to start working on. And this one is school construction. And John Gray is not here yet. We're a minute ahead. Committee, the one we seem to be the most concerned about, we've got 1 minute, is 542. And I've got down, we should have, if we had A&R, I think we should have the Attorney General, since they seem to be our funding source. See if there's anything even hopeful there for settlements.
Can we hear from the North Country Union High School principal? Because I know it's been through a lot of.
They got it.
Principal
Yeah.
or superintendent.
I think principal was on the ground having to deal with it on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, we'll see if you can get some contact information, we'll get him in. Yeah, anybody else that has someone they want to see here from us. We will hear from David Scher on the unclaimed property. Is there anyone else? Might want to hear from on that one. Sounds. Crazy technical, but.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, maybe we should get the NEA on that one.
Yeah, and there's two provisions, one for NEA and then one for is it the municipal employees?
Yeah. So we should hear from the league on that one.
Is that their union?
Well, maybe
The municipal
municipal
employees union.
Yeah,
They're not part of the.
no. they
No,
aren't.
but what is the municipal employees union? There's. It is like or something like that.
Yeah, well, firefighters, I think they have their own
The
thing.
firefighters have a union,
I don't know about the police.
but I think they might all be under, or many of them are. Burlington is big enough. I think they're all under the municipal employees pension, I think, and I believe
They are.
that's what the, I know they do liability, that the league's insurance manages. So we'll reach out to the league, and if they aren't the right ones, they can steer it.
What about on 542? Do we want to hear from the Commissioner of Health?
Yes,
Excuse me, what was that?
that's on the, 542 on the health impacts of PCDs. Okay, so John is here.
Hello,
Hello, welcome back.
what's going on?
Brief vacation from us,
Yes.
and I think I'm ready to go on the yield bill. As I sat down and read it.
Good.
Am I gonna vote anything out today?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Did we hear about the pilot thing on that? Because that was the one financial thing that we didn't get testimony on. There's a change to the pilot.
Yeah.
Program.
Oh, yes, the funding down, so no, we won't be doing it. I don't think we get anything else. I brought it up.
It's okay.
To the office, yeah,
Okay.
it's a change. I don't know if it was during fiscal, somebody gave it to me this morning.
I have it. I
It's,
just want to make sure it's okay.
yes, it's
Okay.
just an adjustment to the things that we've already done. Okay. Yes, all right, John, so we are on 9:55.
So,
One section.
yeah, I'm John Gray with the Office of Legislative Counsel. What would you guys like me to do? Do you want me to go over the text in 955 again, or I also have a presentation that's kind of a longer overview of history leading up to the bill? You may not be interested in that, just say I do have it, but I'm happy to just talk through the sections again if that's what's most helpful.
This is one, I talked with the chair of education, and
Okay.
this is the one area where we overlap. There's a bunch that are clearly ours, but this one is an overlap, and I know he's proposing some changes, so if you can walk us through the bill and they've come to anything they've gone so far as perhaps.
So, yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'll be in the Zoom in just a moment. And can screen share with you just, high level, and noted this last week. You know, the main, if you remember, only one thing is that the proposed form of aid in H955 is leveraging additional state bonding capacity. You'll recall that Act 73 from last year, which created a state aid program that was effective this July 1, exclusively had aid in the form of a debt service subsidy. So districts would continue to bond the full amount locally, and the state would go out and provide a certain percentage of the annual debt service
And as
cost.
funds became available.
Exactly. And so, and that would be, 20 to 40%. The proposal in H955 is, it doesn't do away with the debt service subsidy model, but it supplements it with potential state bonding capacity, which is, like many things, TBD. I was not trying to be funny.
But appropriate subject Kitchell should have taken me up in the offer to buy a printing press many years ago. As subject to funding being available seems becoming a rather
Yes.
commonly used term.
Yeah, I mean, and I would know, I know why folks request the language, because it's clear. It's the case that things are subject to funding, like you say it, like that.
So essentially, the towns, as they do now, will need to bond. The
Yes,
state, as it hasn't been, except perhaps for Burlington, where there was an appropriation, because that was a major. Yeah,
so,
come up with some fun.
and we'll get to it when you talk about kind of the hybrid form that the aid can take. But as you can imagine, if the state is providing aid in the form of state bonding, then the districts themselves should decrease the amount that they bond locally, so that you have sort of a combination of state and local bonding. You wouldn't want districts to be bonding the full amount, like covering their costs. You'd use debt to pay debt. Yeah. Okay. So the school construction sections of H955 start at section 65. And it begins with the findings and intent section. I typically gloss over these. I think I mentioned this last week too, but I think in this case, it's actually helpful, maybe less so the findings, which should be pretty obvious to folks. You got a huge need. That's what one says. If you want me to read line for line, word for word, I can do that. But, okay.
This 600,
Yeah, so this is saying that years ago, there was a facilities assessment that was required in
Yeah.
2021, back in 2021. It identified at that time, well, a few years later, because the work had to be done, it identified total need of $6 billion over a 21-year period. That would result in average annual need of 300 million, and that's just to achieve replacement in kind. So that's not producing new facilities, 21st century educational standards. And really the point of this is just, there's a big need. And it's almost a rhetorical point, right? These needs have only grown since their estimation. So big need, that's what one says. On page 113, this is just spelling out the way that pressures fall as a result of the current funding system. So school construction expenditures are paid from the ed fund and therefore apply pressure to property taxes. While non-property tax revenues support a share of those expenditures, property tax revenues make up the bulk of the ed fund, and they are expected to make up an even larger share as non-property tax revenues decrease, or as ed fund expenditures outpace growth in non-property tax revenues. So this is just saying big need, this falls on property taxes. 3 is talking about some of the incentive structures and way that decision-making occurs within Vermont's education funding system. While school construction decisions are made at the local level, as we know, ed spending is raised statewide through locally varying homestead property tax rates. So the costs of that decision making are spread across all taxpayers. Decision to bond locally increases both that district property tax rate and property taxes across Vermont. Noting another feature of Vermont's education funding structure, because all of these things fall into the bucket at spending, you're asking school districts to weigh operating expenditures against capital expenditures. They're within the same budgetary constraints. So long as both costs are borne by that property tax, school districts are somewhat disincentivized from taking on those projects, and certain communities may struggle to support even necessary school construction expenditures. I think this particular line is called out for many reasons, but one of them is that the proposed updates to the aid section contemplate much larger aid, like up to 95% coverage. And I think that the thinking there is if communities are struggling to support even necessary school construction expenditures and are disincentivized in ways, you need a substantial aid package to move the needle for districts. Of course, one consequence of changing the amount of aid available proportionately for a district is that with the same limited funds, you shrink the number of projects covered. And so the measures that result in a project receiving funds, the priority points that result in it being first to access funds, and the bonus incentives that give additional aid to the project become really important. If you have a limited pool of funds and you're covering a substantial amount of a project cost, then it's a pretty meaningful way that the legislature can shape the kinds of projects they want to have happen, because only a limited amount of funds is available. 5 is saying Act 73 last year didn't identify a new revenue source. And then
20 pages in the middle of that bill, we just skipped over.
I like that. Yep. Okay. Intent section. So some of this is fairly generic, as you can imagine, in one greater scale, decrease efficiency of delivery of education service, encourage efficient use of funds. That language you may recall from the task force report back in 2024. It's using similar language here. Addressing inequities in ed funding across the state, and like we just talked about, trying to remove those disincentives to the construction of necessary and education appropriate school facilities. Recognizing the opportunity offered by the current situation the state is in. This is a chance to, dramatically shape the way that school construction is done going forward. And then really significantly, this is where the actual kind of specific vision of the bill is set out. Subdivision 4 on page 114. In the short term, catalyze the state aid for school construction program by providing state aid in the form of up to an additional $50 million annually in state bonding capacity to support the construction or renovation of school facilities that support the consolidation of school governance structures and improve access to educational opportunities for public school students. So a few pieces here. One is kind of an envisioned short-term fix. I should say there's nothing in the bill that sunsets the idea. So when I say short-term, that's reflecting the intent that I heard. There's nothing that says this is only for 5 years or something.
But that's bonding capacity,
Yep.
not.
Exactly, not the debt service subsidy, not the program as a whole. So this is saying still haven't identified, a revenue source, leverage additional state bonding capacity up to this 50 million annually if that's what's available. And then there's this call out that you're going to see a number of times, and I'll probably stop saying the full phrase, but support the construction or renovation of school facilities that support the consolidation of school governance structures and improve access to educational opportunities for public school students. That's the generic call out to what the purposes of the bill are. And so what it's trying to say is direct these funds toward projects that align with the goals of this bill. That's what it's trying to say. Maybe it could say that more clearly. I don't know. The $50 million figure comes from a specific place that is not arbitrary. The House committees heard testimony, from these guys on the sideline here, related to the amount of state bonding capacity that is potentially available. And so this figure is traced to that testimony, but in any event, this is intent language, and the House was careful not to suggest something here that diverges from CDAC recommendations, but instead tasks the Treasurer's Office in consultation with CDAC with putting out a recommendation for what the actual appropriate amount of annual state bonding support that could be offered without impact the state's credit rating. So that's the thinking there. In the long term, and I'm on page 115 now, provides state aid in the form of a debt service subsidy to school districts pursuing school construction projects that align with the program. This is what was in Act 73, right? That debt service subsidy. And then sub 6 is trying to foreshadow that you could have multiple forms of state aid. So throughout Vermont's education transformation, provide state aid through multiple funding streams. It could be that debt service subsidy plus state bonding support until that burden on property taxpayers imposed by school construction can be reduced. And then 7, I think, states something sort of implicit in all of the discussions thus far and in the program that Act 73 enacted, leveraging the capacities of the Vermont Bond Bank to simplify those issuances, increase financing opportunities, and protect the state's credit rating. So this is the vision that the set of sections here are meant to support. And really, if you were only to take one piece away from this, it would be to read this subdivision 4, which is catalyzing the program, leveraging additional state bonding capacity to support the goals of the bill. Okay, section 66. This is the establishment of permanent classified positions at the AOE to staff the school construction division. So 1 school construction program director, 1 financial manager, 1 school construction coordinator, and 1 architectural design reviewer or educational facility planner. I should have gone back and looked. I cannot recall the report from which these positions originate. I just know that these were drawn from an AOE report suggesting staffing for the school construction division. The one thing I would note here is that these are the minimal positions to match that language. It's specifically noted in that report that you might need more in this bucket. Sorry, I can never highlight the right subdivision for some reason. I'm gonna stop. Sub 4, that you may need more architectural design reviewers. So this is providing the minimal amount of 4 positions, but importantly, what does it mean? Obviously, these positions aren't in the budget that you guys saw on the floor today. So B is saying that the Secretary of Education should include these as part of the budget for FY28, appropriate funding levels, and importantly, appropriate funding levels for any other positions necessary to staff the school construction division. So that's meant to get at, in part, that you might need more positions in this bucket for, or maybe you need other positions as well. So trying to staff that school construction division, but again, these aren't traveling in the budget, so this would be in the future. Okay, section 67, these are updated rulemaking provisions. You may recall that Act 73 transferred, because as you know, the state board currently under the program that's under moratorium has rulemaking authority for the school construction program. And so there's an existing set of rules already out there. They will be transferred, I think it's this summer, July 1, to the AOE, and then the AOE was tasked in the Act 73 with updating those rules, doing additional rulemaking to build out the program. This is not trying to provide an independent, separate grant of rulemaking authority. It is meant to be overlaid on top of that existing grant. It does impose a timeline, which you may want to ask the question whether this is achievable. March 31st, 2027, right? That's relatively soon. So lots of times when we set out rulemaking provisions, we just say begin by X date, right? We don't necessarily contemplate what the deadline is because we don't know how long it will take. In this case, I think the House, they should be the ones to speak to it, but I think the thinking here is because it's not an independent grant, they want to be standing this up soon. There is an accelerated deadline, but again, the question stands, what can be done? And in particular, if you don't have the fully staffed school construction division, just a question there. So what kinds of rules? This is leveraging the existing authority here, which was in Act 73. And it's saying, as you know, when you grant rulemaking authority, you don't give just a blanket, ability to do anything. You cabin that grant of essentially legislative authority. And so you can do this in different ways. What this is saying is that within that broad bucket, adopting rules on school construction capital outlay, make sure to specifically address these things. 1, prioritization and bonus incentives that support the construction and renovation of school facilities that do this thing we just talked about. Support the consolidation of school governance structures and improve access to educational opportunities. If you wanted to tweak or direct the ways that projects are awarded under the program. I would offer that this is a natural place to do that. By saying we want prioritization and bonus incentives to take into account these factors. We want to reward these kinds of projects, not these, right? But this is an area where you can, you have the generic call out now. And actually highlighting the correct text, you have this generic call out, but you could make it more specific if you wanted to. Second, rules to address the treatment of school districts' outstanding capital indebtedness as of December 31st, 2025. It's worth noting that there's a later provision of the bill, section 74, which, while there's no revenue source backing it, does set out legacy debt aid, and it's tied to the same date.
Yeah, so were you done with that little piece?
Yes.
Thank you. A few things. I don't know. I do think March 31st seems like it's coming up quickly. I also think a lot of this work has already been done, so it might be a matter of just like the mechanics of rulemaking. I don't know, but I think that'd be interesting to hear. Can you, maybe when you're done doing all of this, can you explain the role of the treasurer in all of this? Because treasurer's office was very helpful when we were sort of getting all of this work off the ground. I'm just wondering what role they're gonna play.
That'll come later.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
And it's in statute a relatively discrete thing, but yes, the origination of the proposal is certainly larger involved than the initial principles. And there's still, outstanding questions there. So on this treatment of school districts' outstanding capital indebtedness, I did just want to note, because you have that section 74, which seems to speak to one of the ways that debt might be treated, you might want to think about the interaction of tasking AOE with rulemaking on this piece, while at the same time saying offer 100% aid or legacy debt as of December 31st, 2025. So just something to note. Okay. Section 68, the advisory board, and unlike most of the provisions of the state aid program that were enacted in Act 73, the advisory board actually went effective last summer. We've already seen some text from this group. This is a report for that group on or before December 1st of this year, and it's basically to identify school construction opportunities. So on or before December 1 of this year, the advisory board to provide a written report to the legislature that one identifies opportunities for construction or renovation of school facilities that do this generic call out, meet the goals of the act, the bill. So identify opportunities for school construction that align with H 955. For each identified opportunity, provide a full siting study that would include cost, location, any other factors that the board deems relevant to the legislature's consideration of the project. And then, as you can imagine, if you've identified these big school construction projects, which might be of regional scope, right, to potentially encourage consolidation, it might be that not all of the projects are compatible with all of the others. So that is what 3 is trying to get at. Analyze the compatibility of each identified project with the others and evaluate different statewide scenarios, so different configurations for all of those opportunities, so that the state could pursue multiple opportunities for consolidation across Vermont. In developing this report, the board shall specifically consider how to achieve appropriate scale given research on school size and travel times, and how to achieve regional comprehensive high schools. So the thing here is, advisory board come back at the end of this year with some opportunities identified for constructing new facilities that kind of support the consolidation goals of the act. And then give like a statewide analysis of if any could sort of fit together. It doesn't say what will happen with these. It's just information the legislature would receive.
I have a question. Thank you, Madam Chair. I should know the answer to this question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Is there a definition in statute of what a regional comprehensive is? I know this summer on the redistricting committee, we thought about creating districts around regional comprehensive high schools, but the bottom line is the placement of our current schools is not ideal or equitable and geographically appropriate. So it became a much harder task than we originally thought it would be, that would have taken much longer than 3 months, so. I think it's the definition.
So I'm unfortunately going to be relatively unhelpful. This is something that, members negotiated a lot, and then I just accepted the text that they wanted to include. At the same time that this was passing out of the House, there was a CTE bill traveling that did have a defined term. But there was some question as to whether or not to align with that. I think given the uncertainty around what was happening there, didn't really tie it out to resolve the pieces. So I don't have an answer for you, and not just because I happen to not know, but because folks do need to resolve what that is.
Thanks.
Section 69. Okay, up to this point, we've been talking about session law provisions, reports, rulemaking, intent, and the like. We're now shifting gears a little bit, and we're amending what you're seeing here is amending the provisions that were enacted in Act 73. So this is the statement of policy for the school construction aid program in Act 73, and it includes all of this that goes effective this July 1. I'm going to skip past it to show you the new piece. And this is tied to the intent language that you saw. So on page 118, it is further the intent of this chapter to prioritize school construction projects that align with the creation of new school governance structures under everything you see on lines 7 through 9, that legislation enacted by because we're now touching the green books and we're not within the bill. This is the generic call out that is used to reference H955. So it'll really, this is just saying it is further the intent of this chapter to prioritize school construction projects that align with the creation of new school governance structures under H955. That's what it's saying. And it is the intent of this chapter to leverage additional state bonding capacity to support the construction of these projects while the state continues to identify the total school construction need to be supported by state aid. So this is exactly what we talked about in the session law intent section, but this is pulling it into the actual program statutory text. And part of why that matters is that I believe in the rulemaking, in the directives to AOE and the set of responsibilities that AOE has for this program, one of them is to conduct rulemaking, right? And it says, including rulemaking to address prioritization and bonus incentives that align with the intent in 3440, whatever it is. So sometimes intent language has no real potential for substantive effect. It's just there. This is an instance where the intent language could have a substantive effect because it's meant to be pulled into that grant of rulemaking authority. But it's the same kind of intent that we talked about when I first sat down. Section 70, this is a flow through change that will make more sense once I get to some of the sections later, but this is updating the AOE responsibilities that I was just talking about. Actually, you can see it right here. The piece I was just talking about, adopting rules, including rules to specify a point prioritization methodology and a bonus incentive structure aligned with the legislative intent expressed in section 3440. That would necessarily pick up the new text that we just walked through. So that's pulled into this grant of rulemaking authority. But the new language that you see is Act 73 required AOE under the program to include in its annual budget request a school construction funding request. This was calling out, as you can expect, including any projects like those under the intent language that we just walked through for funding through state bonding. So in providing that annual school construction funding request, let the governor know, the legislature knows the consequence, which projects would be supported through state bonding. 3443, this is a relatively minor change to the advisory board. So currently the board, I say currently, I guess this is effective as of now. Currently the board has the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of the AOE. This is language clarifying that specifically they would have the assistance of the school construction division and the school construction program director. You might expect that to be implicit in having the assistance of the AOE, but this is clarifying that that is the case. And then the language that you see struck in subsection G, this is just struck because it's a time-limited provision that is now passed, right? This is a report that was due December 15th of last year. You don't need to maintain this in the green books. So it's no substantive effect. It's just eliminating a time limited provision. Okay, on page 120, we are shifting to what I call kind of the core aid provision section. This is what sets out the application process, the award of aid. You're going to see a lot of language that is drawn from Act 73 that isn't underlined, just provided for context. This sets out that it's a dual step process with a preliminary application. The secretary has to undertake particular considerations when reviewing applications, and then subdivision B has these sets of eligibility conditions. These aren't updated except in this subdivision 4 by H 955. And I will note that this is intended to be a non-substantive change, but to address just a temporal, a kind of a sequencing problem. So one of the eligibility conditions is that the applicant achieves the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards regarding facilities management. As I understand that, that's a self-assessment. So a district self-assesses that they meet the standards adopted by rule for facilities management. The language that you see on 122, the top of page 122, is trying to get at a newly formed school district that might have an application for state aid coming in and trying to ensure that they aren't hindered from pursuing an application if they just haven't yet done that self-assessment. In some ways it's sort of non-intuitive. I don't know how necessary it is. This is just trying to get a problem. So it says if the applicant's a newly formed school district, the applicant will achieve the level of proficiency. But as you can imagine, if it's a self-assessment, hopefully they can just do that and meet the existing standard. But that's why this is included here, not intended to be substantive change. It's just it's intended to make sure that new districts are not hindered from submitting applications if they have something, at the ready, basically, to go. Okay, I noted this last week. This is something that raises some questions about practically how to do a program that contemplates state bonding and local bonding. What you have here is existing law. So I'm going to read out the struck language. Following approval of a preliminary application and provided that the district has voted funds or authorized a bond for the total estimated cost, the agency shall assign points. It may be that there is a happy resolution of this if the thinking is that a district authorizes a bond, but only issues the amount that they need to issue once they know their aid package. But the language is struck here to say a district isn't going to know what it needs to authorize in bonding until it knows its state aid package, because it needs to shrink its local bonding amount by the amount the state bonds for. There may be a happy resolution to this if what you could have is just that the district authorizes funds, but then only needs to go out and bond for a smaller amount. So there may be a way to do it, but that's why it's struck here. It's a sequencing problem to ensure that districts can access the program, even though they're not going to know what their aid package is, obviously, until they've gone through it. So it's trying to solve for the problem that a district couldn't receive priority or final application approval until it had voted those funds. Sub 4, we've kind of already hinted at this, but it is a really key provision. The agency submits its annual school construction funding request to the governor as part of the annual budget, and shall clearly identify those projects of the intent section for funding through state bonding. Following submission of the government budget and the recommended capital budget, the House Committees on Education and Ways and Means and the Senate Committees on Finance shall recommend a total school construction appropriation to the General Assembly. The last lines here are really intended to be non-substantive and they'll make more sense later. But the idea is that a later section, which spells out education payments, the updates to that section say your education payment includes a host of things, including your payments under the state funding of public education chapter and your capital construction aid under this chapter. But importantly, it's saying, identify projects for support through state bonding in that budget request, flows through to the recommended budget and the capital budget. And then these committees of jurisdiction would recommend to the General Assembly, would then have to take action on what the total school construction appropriation would be. In the final approval section, we have the same sequencing problem here, so the same language is struck. And then the big updates are to the award of construction aid section. And this really begins at the top of page 125. Last year, Act 73 had a debt service subsidy model with 20 to 40% aid available for the eligible debt service cost. That 20% is the base amount. And if the district met particular conditions for bonus incentives that are spelled out in rulemaking, they could get up to an additional 20% to bring them to a total of 40% aid. The new program is funding 50% as a base amount of the total approved cost. And you get an additional 45%. So that could bring you to a maximum of 95% aid, the total approved cost of the project. Under sub B, you see the point that we've discussed a couple of times here already. The construction aid shall be awarded as a debt service subsidy. It's Act 73 and support through state bonding. It's this bill, or is it a combination of both? Amounts would be awarded annually, subject to an annual appropriation for purposes of the program. And the current fix for the sequencing problem, although you still have practical sequencing issues, shall be released only once the applicant has voted funds or authorized that bond for the total estimated cost to be covered by the applicant, which is what they would know once they do their state aid package. They could then decrease the amount that they're bonding with them. Okay, this was, I think, Senator Gulick's earlier question about the treasurer's role. And I'm on page 125, starting line 15, subdivision C. It's helpful to think about the path that got to this subdivision. Initially, this was something that mirrored pretty closely the intent language we first started with that said use $50 million annually in state bonding support to catalyze the program. Out of cautionary attempt to ensure that at no point does the legislature step out of line with CDAC recommendations, that has been replaced. And what you see here is tasking the treasurer's office in consultation with CDAC, the Capital Debt Portability Advisory Committee, with recommending to the committees of jurisdiction. It's more expansive here than even the legislative appropriation request. That's education, ways and means, corrections and institutions, and on Utah's side, education, finance, and institutions. So including the institutions committees in this recommendation. Treasurer in consultation with CDAC recommends to the committees of jurisdiction the annual total state bonding support available for the capital budget and this program and the annual debt service subsidies to be awarded under this chapter. So what is available for the capital budget as a whole? That includes your standard capital bill pieces, but it also includes what would be available for the state aid program. Additionally, what are your annual debt service subsidy amounts? And included at the request of the corrections and institutions committees out of concern that this proposal might reduce the amount of state bonding capacity available for this sort of standard capital bill process. The recommendation shall include an analysis of the use of state bonding support for school construction under the program, how it affects the overall capital budget capacity. Essentially asking the question, did this result in reductions of the amounts available for the capital bill, or is this truly additional state bonding capacity? Last new addition here that's just kind of clarifying the existing independent prevailing wage requirements already in state and federal law, says any contract awarded for school construction that is paid for with state aid shall adhere to the higher prevailing wage requirements established for state construction projects or prevailing local wage requirements under federal law. Things big in that. Okay, section 73, really small but big in impact. In existing law, you'll know that there's a prohibition on extending state aid to projects that the secretary determines the need for which results from significant deferred maintenance. We talked about how the existing school facilities portfolio might be composed of a lot of projects where the need results from significant deferred maintenance. So this proposes to repeal that prohibition on extending state aid to those kinds of projects. Section 74, I'm sure that you'll recall this from last week, but this is your legacy debt aid provision. There is no revenue source identified for this. It says that a school district shall be eligible to receive aid equal to 100% debt service costs, debt incurred by a district for costs related to facility construction and renovations, that exist as of December 31, 2025. So a simple statement of that, 100% paid for legacy school construction debt that exists as of the end of last year.
And I know this is a section that this Senate Education Committee is looking at.
Is one predictably everyone has feelings about. Again, no revenue source identified, and technically this goes effective this summer. So they would be eligible to receive it, but there wouldn't be money. Aid shall be, and this is where you can see the limitation on anything going on. Aid shall be awarded annually for annual debt service costs up to a maximum total annual amount of 61 million. That is the estimated kind of main biggest impact that could happen from existing debt costs in a year. And importantly, subject to annual appropriation for purposes of the legacy fund aid. Section 75 and 76 are the piece I noted earlier where I said to ignore this. This 4011 is a section on education payments. This is what tasks you guys with appropriating funds to cover all of the education costs. And this is just kind of grouping them together. It says the General Assembly shall appropriate funds for an education payment, pay for all things. Pay for your statewide education spending, portion of your base education amount, any other amounts the state is obligated to provide under this chapter or chapter 123. It is not an independent grant of new payments. It's saying you have existing payments that are owed to districts, pay them as part of this bigger education payment. So it just gives you kind of a way to call out all the sets of payments. It's not intended to have a substantive effect. But it is here, and it's here twice because this specific section is amended if the contingencies in Act 73 are met. And so in the future, here you'll see the reference to EOP and supplemental district spending, all of those fun things. Okay, section 77, we're switching gears a little bit. We've mainly up to this point been talking about the state aid program that is largely going effective this summer, regardless of whether revenue source exists to support it. And we're now looking at supplemental district spending right, which is future. So this is only if the foundation formula contingencies are met, is this applicable? And this is updating the way supplemental district spending works. You'll recall that there's a 5% cap on what can be pursued locally through supplemental district spending. You may recall additionally that there are transition measures in Act 73, so that in the first, I think 5 years is a 10% cap and then it's gradually brought down so that in FY, if you stick with Act 73's timeline, which is not what this bill has, but if you follow the timeline here, I think you would be transitioned to 5% in FY 40. So here, it's just clarifying that that cap would not in any instance apply to school construction expenditures. And the thing that I flagged for you last week is that implicit in this decision is the decision to fund school construction through supplemental district spending, which is not a decision that was made during the Act 73 process. I'm going to keep saying that every time I talk about this, but just.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so last year, many questions were unresolved, right? And one of them is where school construction would be raised. It's sort of intuitive to think that it might be raised through supplemental district spending because that is the other avenue that we know outside of the EOP. But it was never firmly set or established that that would be the place that school construction is raised. And if you think about it, we have the equalization mechanics for raising supplemental district spending. And if you had large expenses funded through supplemental district spending, even if you didn't have a cap, which was in part what removing a cap for these purposes would make available, it could be quite hard to raise these funds at the equalization mechanic, which is tied to the lowest taxing capacity district. So my point is just in choosing to say that the cap doesn't apply to school construction expenditures, you wouldn't say that unless school construction expenditures were being raised through supplemental district spending.
Exactly.
And my point is just that no one ever really decided that. It's implicit here, but it was not a committed. It may be fine. I'm just saying, I hope that folks will make that as an intentional, deliberate decision, right? It could be fine either way. I just hope that the committees say, yes, we think this is the best place for it, or say, we're still working on it and there's time yet because the foundation formula is years out. My hopes don't matter, but that's why I bring it up. It's just don't accidentally make a big decision. Section 78 is clarifying language for ballots. This originates from a discussion in the Ways and Means Committee around what would you do if a district in the future state with the foundation formula voted a school construction project in 1 year, and then because you don't have to go out every year and vote a budget like the current systems, but only need to do it when you're spending above EOP. What if they voted a school construction project? They're therefore committed to ongoing annual debt service costs. If they didn't want to go out and do a supplemental district spending vote each year, what would you do with that scenario? Because now it's being covered through the supplemental district spending tax. This is just updating the ballot language to provide two forms of the ballot. One is largely what you saw last year in Act 73. Shall the voters of the school district approve the school board to expend however many dollars for expenditures other than annual debt service costs on any outstanding capital indebtedness, which is the amount that the school board has determined to be necessary in excess of the EOP. So this is what you would do. This is the ballot language you would put out in any year that you are not pursuing school construction. That might be what you do every year you do it. It's clarifying you're just voting on non-construction expenditures that are raised through the supplemental district spending tax. But note that you would still get the information as to what your estimated rate would be, which would cover the cost of your annual construction. Sub E is the new language. It says that if you're going out in that instance to vote on a school construction project, the board shall present concurrently with any vote to incur indebtedness for school construction a supplemental district spending budget to the voters. And it would say this would have this different form. Shall the voters of the school district approve the school board to expend X amount, which is the amount that the board has determined to be necessary to cover the annual debt service cost of school construction and any other expenditures in excess of EOP, and then you would get your estimated cost. So it's trying to make the ballot language clearer and also clarify that you can't kind of go back on the decision that you made when you chose to bond. I will just note that this is a problem that exists under the current funding system as well, maybe in a slightly more attenuated way, but you currently take on a long-term obligation and then have to cover your annual debt service cost through that spending. So today you are obligated to vote on amounts to cover, or I say that because you could choose to default as well, but presumably no one's doing that. So
But this language is new.
yes, this language is new, and my point is just that the problem that the House is trying to solve is a problem that also exists. Again, maybe in a more attenuated fashion because of the way the budget is presented today. But it is a conceivable thing under Vermont's current funding structure that you could have a similar problem. Not to say that it's not a good idea, it's for folks to have clear balance. That's the school construction pieces. I can stop there. I know that I said a lot. I have other measures, but you also heard last week. What would you guys like from me?
That's a lot. I'm looking around time frames for witnesses. If I took the committee a 5-minute tax break, break, would that work for you?
Yeah.
Okay, I think you'll get better attention if they get to stand out, so we open the door and get some oxygen in this room.
Yeah.
It's starting to feel very stuffy. Okay, so we will be back